This video is just going to be brief. I prefer these CC videos to be, preferably just brief and I've never scripted any of these actually. I may one day, but I feel as though I'd prefer to be more conversational about this because I feel like to go the full gamut and try to script these would be pretentious given that I know little to nothing about music theory, and so I figure just being as authentic as possible is the only way to go when I'm going about one of these music reviews here. So forgive the inadequacy if you feel that way. Feel free to comment if you feel this way. Although I know that YouTube isn't as brutal as it was circa 2007/2008, and if someone feels negatively about a video, they're less inclined to just leave an anonymous comment and berate the uploader and just not even leave a dislike. They'll just move on and complain about it maybe elsewhere. Do feel free. Pretend it's still this era. Like share as much criticism as you'd like. I honestly would prefer to hear the criticism than not hear it, and have it. I'd rather improve than not improve. Put it like that. And plus, it just kind of it's kind of exhilarating to see. Oh shit, kind of amuses me too. But the prospect of being criticized anywhere at any time has really stifled creativity, I feel, or at least it caused artists to second guess themselves a hell of a lot more than they might have in a pre-social media era or a pre-internet era. When you were just some isolated artist in the 90s, you didn't give a damn. Your influences were your influences. You came across them. No one was going to berate you for not knowing, every other artist or not having this influence or that influence. If they liked you, they liked you. You were you. Now you've got the history of art at our fingertips. And so it's just, is that going to help artists? Is it going to make them too aware of a canon or too aware of what's come before and they're stifled? Simon Reynolds argued this in one of his texts, and I think there's partly something to be said for that. I also suspect that a lot of it has to do with this idea of instant feedback is really brutal. I mean, we have to remember two of the most acclaimed and beloved filmmakers of all time, including at that time, attempted suicide, Kurosawa, over increasing negative reviews over films which did not remotely deserve them, by the way. It was just political garbage, frankly. And then, of course, David Lean being berated by those critics after Ryan's Daughter, a movie which deserved some criticism, to be fair, but the fact that he did not make another film until A Passage to India, which is an absolute masterpiece, I think is a crying shame. It just goes to show artists are phenomenally sensitive to this sort of thing. And especially people beyond my age, people older than, say, 40 or 50, they come onto the internet and they think the abuse that young people inflict upon each other and upon older people, upon anyone, is insane. Like, oh my god, all these young people are going to be, like, traumatized forever. The fact is, we kind of grew up with it. I was born in 1996. We kind of grew up with the possibility that you could be berated and belittled on the internet at any time. It doesn't... If I randomly got a bunch of messages on comments on YouTube telling me to commit suicide, I would literally just be like, that's the internet, Whereas someone who had never had any idea of this, someone who maybe if you were born many decades ago and this happened to you, you'd be horrified. You would be quite psychologically scarring for you. It just is what it is, unfortunately. I sometimes think about whether a Robert Smith would have written or tried to record any of his music today. It's kind of an inexplicable scenario to imagine because Robert Smith would have influenced so much of contemporary music, that very confessional style of music. Not that it was the domain and the invention of Robert Smith. Robert Smith was clearly probably very inspired by presidents such as Ian Curtis, for example. I know 17 Seconds compared to now actually finally getting into the music. Hooray. I said this would be a brief video. What a hack I am. The 17 Seconds as a composer to Free Imaginary Boys sounds like a lot more of an attempt to nab the Joy Division sound. I'm not complaining about that. I adore Joy Division. 17 Seconds is a more palatable, commercially kind of accessible take on the Joy Division sound. For a long time, I wasn't a big fan of The Cure because I think the kind of Disintegration, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me era stuff is just not very good. And the stuff beyond that's even worse. That's what I was mostly familiar with because it's their most popular and played widely shared material. And then I got more into their early work. I still think and their early work I just considered lesser Joy Division, lesser Susie and the Banshees, lesser Magazine, whomever you want to name, even little groups like Mass or obviously groups that come a bit later, like the Jangle Acts, like the Smiths, or you want to go to contemporary groups more contemporary to the Cure, like Echo and the Bunnymen, that era of the Cure, the post-punk era. And so I'd be thinking, well, what's the point of the Cure? Because they were so acclaimed, and yet I thought their music was just lesser versions of these bands. Well, the fact of the matter is, the more I kind of, you go through Joy Division, you go through Echo and the Bunnymen, you go through Susie, you go through the Chameleons, and you're just like, I want more. Maybe I'll just give those Cure albums a whirl. And they are fantastic. You're just like, okay. One just thought that there was no reason. One was so enamored with Joy. I guess it was a bit of a bitterness of just how many people like the Cure. It was just, Friday on my mind. That's the easy beats. Friday, I'm Australian, so that's the first thing that comes to my mind. Friday, I'm in love. Rubbish. But so that kind of confessional, when a rock group was singing about very personal things and kind of, in a manner that was very heartbreaking and kind of a very confessional kind of, they saw themselves as a more intimate romantic poet. And by romantic, I mean kind of, Keats Coleridge romantic, in that English tradition. And this, insofar as like Nirvana were as influential as they were, Nirvana were getting that from bands that were influenced by, beginning with, you could say it begins with Joy Division possibly, and The Cure, the next big group in line, and then plenty of influential acts on Nirvana had that very confessional style of lyrics. Husker Du was one of them, for example. Someone like Pete Townshend tended to compose characters and storylines with which to share his personal experiences. With Robert Smith, it was just right out there, and it was very daring to just write about your depression that way in mainstream music. I mean, there was some folk songwriters could get away with this, and there was a poor Nick Drake who never saw his music be very commercially successful and ended tragically. There were instances like that. It wasn't considered very commercially viable, but the way the Cure developed through the more independent record label scene, and how all those indie labels were, getting some commercial success on their own right, and so the larger labels started looking in, hey, there's a market here, and then eventually it leads to the sub pop era and then to Nirvana over, and then all the kind of emotional hardcore. That's emo essentially. That's that stuff in the 2000s, and now today there's a confessional style is everywhere. I suspect we can be archaeologists and say that the Cure has a lot to do with that. Robert Smith had a lot to do with that. But what would a Robert Smith of today, would they be too? It was one thing to expect bad reviews from the British music press. It's another thing entirely to expect you yourself to be prospectively, and I mean this term kind of in jest, but cancelled and exiled from society, and not for, just for. No, you don't even have to have said the wrong thing in a certain silly political correctness respect, but in a kind of just to be ostracized. You just to not be in the cliques just seems to be such a devastating when approval can be quantified in such a kind of seemingly superficial but potent way. Now, it's this. Would a Robert Smith have done what he did today? Would he been as determined? I don't know. I can't say that for sure. And as depressing as the late 70s and early 80s in the United Kingdom was, are things more depressing now? Did Robert Smith have it blessed and privileged by comparison to people, who were his age in 1980 now? I have to admit, sometimes I sometimes I, as much as I love the internet and the wonders of being alive in the 21st century, God, I feel like things would have felt more hopeful even in the Thatcher era of the UK. Jeez. Oh, man. I mean, did 1980 feel colder? Based on the album cover, I assume so, and the cold feeling of the music, that wintry feel of the music. We could really use some colder weather to balance out the cooking planet right now. How depressing. Then again, a group like This Heat were inspired by a heatwave in the UK in the mid to late 70s. Perhaps what we need is another This Heat. Actually, I sometimes think that insofar as rock music is concerned, or just music is concerned, This Heat really the be-all, end-all. They kind of closed the door, and everything since then is just pretending This Heat never happened, or they haven't heard it yet. More or less. I mean this somewhat in jest, but the music is so good it makes me want to make such audacious statements, But we're not talking about this heat with this video. We're talking about The Cure, 1980, 17 seconds. I'd just like to go over the track list of this particular album, discuss my appreciation for it, a reflection. Okay, that's just like his 2 minute sort of intro thing. Play for Today, brilliant. Secrets, brilliant. I live a night in your house. Free and The Final Sound are kind of these ambient sort of pieces, I believe. Yeah. And then A Forest. That's the most famous song on here. That's good stuff. I have a friend told me a story about how when they were younger, their older brother, the song A Forest came on the radio on like a Triple J or something, and this would have been in the 2000s. I guess they were doing a little retro thing, and the brother started running around in the sunny backyard with his pretend microphone and singing along to all the words. Apparently it's a very vivid memory for my friend. Anyway, I think that's one of these instrumental pieces. You fall in love with somebody else tonight. 17 seconds. Very memorable stuff, except for the tracks which I don't remember, I guess, of the three of them. But I'm pretty sure those are the instrumental pieces. I'm almost positive. I was right on the first two. On A Final Sound and the one before that, Free, those are essentially instrumental pieces. I think there's some like vague sort of lyrics you can hear. It's hard to decipher in the background of Free. M is the you fall in love with somebody else tonight. That's M. At Night, it's that's like my favorite song of all time. I totally forgot about it. Oh gee. I apologize. My only major issue with this album is I just kind of wish it was longer. At 35 minutes, I don't know if it's just I'm enjoying myself too much, but it feels like it's over before you know it. I sometimes also feel as though you probably got like 10 tracks on this album. It feels like there's really just like 7. I mean, 3 of them being instrumental kind of mood pieces, kind of in between tracks, transition pieces. I mean, they're beautiful and I'm very impressed with them and they work well in the context of the album, but I can't help but feel that it's evidence that like they didn't have enough songs and they just had to fill out the album's runtime, make it appear as though there's more tracks, just add 3 more tracks to the listing and then it makes it appear as though that you're getting more. And at 35 minutes, it's still like a reasonable paced album, but I've always felt as though albums under, God, maybe this is a bit too specific, but maybe albums under like 37 minutes. I don't want to say 36, that's too close. They just don't feel as long. But like, it's a silly thought. It's superficial. I guess because 40 minutes, you just feel like, oh wow, like a lot of time has passed and you've just been enjoying yourself for that long. You're just like, how impressive is that? It's almost like more impressive to hold my attention for 40 minutes as opposed to 35. I don't know. Just 5 minutes makes a difference. But what about the actual music on here? Well, that typical post-punk cold wave sound, I'm under the impression that the most popular group which made this sound very well known and imitated is probably The Cure. If it's not The Cure, it's those first couple of U2 albums. But sometimes we think about, like, someone gets into, say, Joy Division, and they think, I'm into this, like, wow, this band's got such a great sound. How come it's not more widespread? That's kind of how I felt when I was first getting into Joy Division. Well, the sound of The Cure, the sound of the U2, that was essentially, obviously, The Cure and U2 became more commercial and developed their sound significantly more so, although they were quite commercially successful in the early 80s, and like the bands who had that, like, say you would have been into, I'll give you an example. Once I was playing the Gentle Giant live album, playing The Fool. I was playing that, and a friend's mother's boyfriend, I'm not sure the situation, but he was like, what are you listening to? It was at his house at the time, and he's like, oh, I'm like, oh yeah, this is Gentle Giant. And he's like, oh, it sounds like Yes. And sometimes you wonder, like, wow, a band like Gentle Giant, they were never as big. And it's like, yeah, they were commercial. You probably know this in the prog story. They were commercial variants which were of prog, which were much more viable, like Yes and ELP. Somehow ELP, the 70s were a different time, I guess. Drug, I don't know if it's just drug. Who knows? Like exciting live shows and all that, I can imagine VLP. But then with the 80s and you wonder, oh, Joy Division and Susie, I wish they were bigger. It's like, yeah, U2 and The Cure with that. That's where, and if someone's, who are you listening to? Joy Division? Oh, I've never heard it. It sounds a bit like The Cure or the U2 or whatever. I remember I was getting into the Smiths when I was in late high school, as you do, and I remember adults who, because the Smiths weren't chart big in Australia. The Smiths were big if you were into kind of cool music and you were in like the Sydney or Melbourne inner city, maybe Adelaide or Brisbane as well, Canberra. I don't know. I'm just assuming. I'm going to, for you guys' sake, I'm just going to assume it is. Much love. But like my parents, had no idea who the Smiths were, for example. And so when I'm getting into the Smiths, they just think it sounds like the Church or something, There were commercial variants of these things, and I guess The Cure was that for the typical post-punk sound as we know it. The Joy Division, the sound, Echo and the Bunnymen, early Simple Minds sort of sound. You know that sound, the traditional classic post-punk sound. Oh, speaking of the Australian context, Icehouse when they were Flowers, One of the best bands of that typical sheen is the Chameleons. They are absolutely phenomenal. Can't praise them enough. Absolutely phenomenal records. This video might have been a waste, if not for one thing. If you haven't listened to 17 Seconds, be open-minded and give it a listen. Especially if you've kind of not been a Cure fan and you want to see what it's all about. If you don't enjoy The Cure, you might not know the songs on this album. Only A Forest got a lot of widespread play as far as I know. And I'm pretty sure that outside of the UK, apparently they're very big in Brazil. I've read or heard that somewhere. But anyway, outside of the UK, I don't think the singles before 1985 made much impact, and so you would know the more popular stuff. My opinion on The Cure is this. I love first album, second album, Free Imaginary Boys, 17 Seconds, and then Faith is brilliant, possibly my favourite of them. And then there's The Top, which I know there's a lot of fans of The Top. They try to reclaim it as this great neo-psych album for the early 80s. I forgot about Pornography. That's a great album, but The Top. Look, I saw the Andy Blacksugar video about The Top, and I just wish I felt that way. I just don't. I just find it kind of not that interesting an album, actually. Maybe because I'm not a musician, it just escapes me. That's the thing. But then The Head on the Door is absolutely brilliant. I think that's an extraordinary album. I'm just like, wow, I love this new sound that they've got, mixing in the pop and the esotericism. It's just absolutely extraordinary. But man, I don't like that. Kiss me, and it's a fucking double album. Is that a joke? Is that an insult? I take it as an insult because fuck you. That's just music's just oh my god. And then Disintegration. It's just it's meant to be like a joke on how pretentious and terrible those overblown concepts, sort of overblown rock opera adjacent albums are. I was just pretending to be stupid. Well, that's a good defense of being stupid, I guess. Is it? If you want a better review of a Cure album, check out the aforementioned Andy Blacksugar video on The Top. In fact, check out I think they're on the Contrarians channel. It may be on one of the associated channels, like Grand Alpha, or what's it called? Grant's Rock Warehouse. That's a good channel. They have better Cure discussions than you'll find here. People like, what are they? Reed Little, Grant, Todd. I don't know that person's last name, but there's fantastic discussions on The Cure out there, which are very exhilarating. I highly recommend them. Todd Evans, he's also on Rush Fans, which is also a really good music channel. All better than Cosmic Criticism, by the way. I'll go toe for toe on Film Talk, don't get me wrong. You don't even fucking try, guys. But, as far as music stuff, it's kind of pathetic on my end, I'll admit. But hey, listen to 17 Seconds by The Cure and or check out someone else's video on The Cure. It'll be superior.